Hello there, and welcome to our special coverage. I'm Karim Zachary coming to you live on All 24 News. All right, here's what's on tap for the day. Russia's war in the DONBAS is becoming a grin. The U.S. Marines could elevate their first black four-star general in more than 2 centuries, and China takes a victory lap in the South Pacific after inking a security deal in the Solomon Islands. Geopolitical tensions in Europe and globally have spiked, and already contentious issues across the globe have become increasingly fraught, deterring China while Russia remains a top priority for the West. The U.S. Army serves as a key player to joint operations in the Indo-Pacific, ready to support and enable the joint force in a future conflict scenario. Meanwhile, Russia's war in Ukraine demonstrates the importance of ground support to NATO allies and other countries. As the war continues with no end in sight, there has been increased interest in targeting Russia's oil exports, which have been financing its war in Ukraine with its 20 billion monthly oil sales, an even more lucrative commodity for Russia than gas. Europe's reliance on Russia for 1/4 of its oil, however, means such a move could impose steep costs on European consumers and industry. All this is going to be analyzed today in our special coverage by our panel of guests. I'm joined live via Skype by Ayub Persoy, lecturer at Department of International Relations, Ahi Ebran University from England. And also from England, we have Stephen Hall, lecturer, assistant professor in politics, international relations, and Russia at University of Bath. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into any discussion, let's have this insight about what's going on the ground. Russian forces have made a significant advance in the Donbas region, mainly in the city of Severodonetsk, which had become under intense bombardment. As a result, 5 civilians died, 12 were wounded, and 47 civilian sites were destroyed or damaged. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said the conditions in the Donbas are incredibly difficult. Meanwhile, the Russian President Vladimir Putin assured for his part that Moscow remains open to a resumption of dialogue with Kiev to resolve the conflict. For his part, the spokesman for the Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed that the Russian army has liberated the strategic locality of Liman in eastern Ukraine. First of all, Professor Ayub Ersoy, thank you for being with us in the show. And let me share with you this question. On the ground in Severodonetsk, the situation is increasingly grim. Ukraine's military is suffering serious losses in the battle for the city and faces the most serious challenge it has encountered since the isolation of the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. All this, and Ukraine is pleading for more effective perhaps weapons that would make it stronger than Russia. Why is the West stalling to send weapons, Professor? Is it because of the risk of wider war between Russia and NATO?
First of all, as you have said, the situation for Ukrainian armed resistance in the Donbas region is not very bright now. Russian Defense Ministry yesterday had announced that it captured the strategically important Liman town. This is important because the town leads to more populous, strategically important towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk in the southwest. So the situation in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine now seems to favor the Russian invasion. And we cannot argue that all the Western alliance members or all the states in the European Union, in Europe or the West, are avoiding providing substantial support to Ukraine. Some states have preferred to waver in their support, but some states, like the United Kingdom, has given unconditional support to Ukrainian armed resistance. So countries in the West have different views on the causes and implications of the Russian invasion. And I don't want to name, but for some countries, the geopolitical implications may not be very favorable for the economy, for the social stability, for their foreign policy. So for these reasons, while some states in the West have provided very strong diplomatic, military, economy support to Ukraine, other states so far have decided to wait for the evolution of the situation in Ukraine, especially in DONBAS.
Thank you indeed. Professor Stephen Hall, thank you for joining us first and foremost. High stakes questions loom large indeed. May perhaps be some of which is how might the conflict evolve on the ground and at the negotiating table, Professor Stephen Hall?
Well, I think that as you're, it was correct that Russia is pushing into the Donbass and Severodonetsk is looking increasingly untenable for Ukraine, although the Ukrainians, at least officially, are still saying that they control the city. If the Russian army is able to push through Severodonetsk, then they will control all of Luhansk. They are also taking more control over Donetsk, the other region in the Donbass. And potentially this is where they will stop. There is apparently some assumption within the Russian government, either that they will push on to Kiev, although that seems unlikely, or that having taken the Donbass, this will then allow them to say that we have won, we've been successful, and now we can start negotiations. Whether those negotiations will happen remains to be seen, but certainly some countries in the West, and again, I'm not going to name them, we should know who they are more willing to try and accede to Russia. They don't want to see Russia humiliated. So this is all very much up in the air at the moment in terms of whether the Russians will be able to take the Donbass. That seems increasingly likely, and whether weaponry will reach Ukraine in time for Ukraine to begin a counteroffensive. They are making some efforts in the Kharkiv region and towards Kherson at the moment, but this may be a little too late.
Mm-hmm. Professor Stephen Hall, still, instead of instating policies based on the flawed assumption that refugees just need temporary humanitarian solutions until they can go home, don't you think that EU countries should create policies that give Ukrainian refugees some level of stability for the medium term at least and support the communities that host them?
I think certainly the EU could do a lot more. I mean, even my own country, the United Kingdom, could do a lot more than it's done. And certainly refugees don't tend to be there for the short term, especially when a war could potentially last, as it could in Ukraine, for a very long time. Therefore, the refugees, the 5.2 million who have fled Ukraine, and that probably is an underestimate of those figures now, should be given a great deal more support. The ability to have access to housing, healthcare, and of course schools for the children and jobs for the mothers. Predominantly they are women and children. So yes, certainly there is a lot more that can be done. And I think that European Union countries and Britain have to accept that Ukrainian refugees are going to be there for a long time, and they have to find ways to accommodate them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed. Moving on now, Russia's president appears to have linked a possible reopening of Ukraine's grain exports to the lifting of Western sanctions imposed. That is, while his French and German counterparts stress the importance of the Russian departure and real peace efforts from Moscow. Meanwhile, farmers across Ukraine are unable to sow their land, missing a critical planting window, while also struggling to ship harvested crops out due to a Russian blockade of Ukraine's critical Black Sea ports. Ukrainian farmers now have an estimated of 22 million metric tons of grain stuck in storehouses. The lack of Ukrainian grain is pushing food prices up and pressing countries already facing shortages toward famine.
There's hunger like in Africa and in other countries, and we've been seeing, dynamic of the population is been missing that food from year to year, and this dynamic is being boosted incredibly. I just can't imagine what might happen without Ukraine to ship actively the next season this exportable surplus.
Odessa has to be reopened, and we need to have an agreement to have it reopened. This diplomatical level has to be discussed with people who can solve the situation, and then we need to have an agreement. As FAO, our Director General also remind that.
Back to you, Professor Ayub Ersoy. Neither Russia nor NATO wants to go to war with the other. But history is rife with examples of states ending up in a war without initially having intended to fight, as well as cases of smaller conflicts sparking broader wars. And the circumstances of the Russian invasion create particularly significant escalation risks. How do you analyze this amid these developments, meaning the food shortage on the one hand, the energy crisis on the other? Professor, yes.
Yeah, we should keep in mind that when the invasion started, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, called for a no-fly zone over Ukraine to prevent Russian airstrikes against Ukrainian forces. But NATO did not answer that call because the NATO member states were afraid of an uncontrollable escalation between Russia and NATO member states. So NATO, as a collective defense organization, has so far avoided any measures that could be interpreted by Russia as undue escalation. So I don't see that the prospects of an armed conflict, a hot conflict between Russia and NATO are very high at the moment. But of course, the NATO membership bids for Sweden and Finland would change these prospects in the future if they are successfully becoming members of NATO. And of course, the Ukrainian crisis has implications for global supply chains in terms of global food security. Many countries in the world are dependent on imports, grain imports from Ukraine and Russia. For example, in the Middle East, Egypt is heavily dependent on supplies from Ukraine and Russia. And today, the bread in Egypt, Aish Beledi, its price is fixed. It is heavily subsidized, and it is imposing a real financial burden on the Egyptian government. So Egypt is just one example. Many countries in the region and in the world are dependent on supplies, and any major disruption of these grain supplies would cause serious problems, social problems, economic problems for sure, for the governments of these countries. And energy is just another dimension of the Ukrainian crisis, and we can elaborate on that later.
Thank you indeed. Professor Stephen Hall, according to analysts, Putin and China's Xi are striving to make the world safe for authoritarianism. How huge a challenge is this for the United States and like-minded democratic partners, according to you?
Well, I think certainly there is this idea of an authoritarian international, that authoritarian regimes are collaborating and they're bolstering one another. China and Russia have a very close alliance. I don't know if that's quite the right word that I would use. Some people have called it a cosplay at an alliance, but they seem to have a very strong personal relationship, Putin and Xi Jinping. So certainly there is a challenge appearing towards America and Western democracies from Russia, from China, because they are trying to reinterpret international norms, trying to put the prevalence of the state above the people. But in terms of what we're actually seeing with the current Ukraine conflict, yes, China hasn't vocally come out in against Russia, but it also hasn't been as supportive as it could have been. And some Chinese companies have started to not trade with Russia to the same extent as they were doing before. Of course, oil and gas is a different kettle of fish, as it were, and China is trying to get more access to Russian oil and gas, but certainly it's not as close a relationship as we thought it would be with the Ukraine crisis. Having said that, Russia does believe that as a great power, whether it is or isn't is irrelevant, it perceives itself to be a great power and is therefore in conflict with America. China has done relatively well out of the current international system and is less willing, let's say, to try and take a wrecking ball to it. So in terms of this authoritarian international and against America, against Western democracies, to an extent it's there, but we have to remember that these two states both perceive themselves as great powers and therefore have their own avenues or areas they want to take against one another if necessary.
Thank you indeed. Moving on now and speaking about energy, Russian giant Gazprom still supplies gas for Europe through Ukraine in the volume of 43.96 million cubic meters per day via the Sudzha gas pumping station. Gazprom spokesman told reporters adding that the request for pumping through Sokranovka was rejected by the Ukrainian side. Professor Ayu Persoy, Hungary may oppose sixth package of sanctions and oil embargo against Russia. Do you think that European unity is at stake here, despite them claiming that Europe is united, however? It seems to be the opposite, since some European countries are against sanctions on Russia.
Definitely, we can observe this disunity, if I may, in the EU's approach to Russian invasion since its beginning. Some countries like Poland has been very vocal about their opposition to the Russian invasion, while some other Western European countries, for them, trying to find a quick solution, a quick fix to the crisis seems to be the highest priority, no matter what the costs for Ukraine. Hungary is just one example, one apparent example, but in addition to Hungary, many states do not see their core interests at stake in this crisis between Russia and Ukraine. But still, some Eastern European states continue to be very insistent on galvanizing European support for Ukraine. And for energy, Russia has halted supplying natural gas to Finland on May 21st. So these constituted one example for Eastern European states close to the Russian border. That Russia challenge must be resisted.
Thank you indeed. Professor Stephen Hall, Western leaders are divided between those who think they can work with Vladimir Putin once Russia's war is over, and those who think they cannot. The war is leading to disputes over the arming of Ukraine, the feasibility of enforcing a Russian oil import embargo, and whether Kiev will have to accept a further loss of territory at the end of the war as the price for peace. What do you think about that?
I think certainly that the West has been fairly united up to a point in regards to Ukraine. But again, it goes back to the idea, I think, that there are certain countries in Europe, in the West, that don't want to necessarily see Russia humiliated. And therefore, they don't want to provide Ukraine with offensive weapons. We've seen from some of the German newspapers that the German government has stopped supplying more weapons to Ukraine. By contrast, you see Britain Czech Republic, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, of course, and Poland providing a lot of weapons towards Ukraine. So there is certainly a divide. I think as well in terms of the NATO expansion, we'll see what happens if Turkey, because Turkey has come out and said that Finland and Sweden will not be able to join NATO until Turkey's wishes about funding for the Kurdistan Workers' Party or supporting terrorists have been addressed. That could take a long time. We can see in terms of the energy as well, there is a huge divide in the West as to what to do in regards to energy, and certainly if Russia is able to cut or stop the grain supplies coming into Europe and the rest of the world, then this will also come into effect and be consider divisions again. We're starting to see the calls by Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron of negotiations with Russia, and Russia has said if you lift sanctions and Ukraine demines a port of Odessa, then we can start to talk about sending out grain. So Russia is also playing up to a Western audience that it knows is fairly divided. The Russian government has always said that the West has a short attention span, and eventually Ukraine will be forgotten. And so Western democracies, Western leaders will start to decide that they have to begin trading again with Russia. This is the hope in the Kremlin. They know that there is division in Europe, and we can see that there's starting to be less of a unification with what to do over Ukraine for European states.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on now about the latest regarding NATO. Following a meeting between the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Finnish counterpart Pekka Haavisto, the top US diplomat said his country is engaged directly with Turkey and that discussions with Ankara would continue. This comes following Turkey's threat to block Finland and Sweden from joining NATO. At a press conference following the meeting, the Finnish foreign minister said it was very important that Turkey's issues with Finland's NATO membership be resolved before the alliance holds a summit in the Spanish capital, Madrid.
The United States fully supports Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, and I continue to be confident that both countries will soon be NATO allies.
Then regarding Turkey, our delegations visited actually Wednesday, both from Sweden and Finland. Turkey had a good negotiations there, long negotiations, agreed to continue those talks, and of course we rely on NATO open door policy, which is also supported by Turkey, and we think that these problems can be solved, at which Turkey has been raised.
Professor Ayub Ersoy, an era of sustained confrontation with Russia, or indeed a security environment conditioned by the disorderly collapse of the Putin regime, will require NATO to rethink its long-term strategy, posture and presence. The West needs a new strategy to prepare for what could be a strategic confrontation lasting decades, requiring a serious alignment between the US and Europe on the main components of a future Russia-West agenda. What's your reading regarding this?
NATO has been preparing for all contingencies since it is establishment. So it wouldn't be a surprise that NATO has already plans for any kind of contingency regarding the Ukraine crisis or regarding any potential conflict between Russia and Russia's Western neighbors, which are members now of NATO. So the current problem for NATO seems to be the membership applications of Sweden and Finland and overcoming Turkey's objections to this membership application. We should keep in mind that in principle, Turkey does not object memberships of Finland and Sweden. It has some security concerns, and which Finland and Sweden are trying to address by sending delegations to Ankara. For now, NATO seems to be focused on making Sweden and Finland integrated members of the alliance, and NATO, in my view, will look forward after this membership process is finalized.
Thank you. Professor Stephen Hall, just as the war has revealed gaps in Russian military capabilities, it has also shown that the multilateral institutions at the heart of the alliance, NATO and the European Union, that is, were not built for such crisis response. In your opinion, what will Europe need in the medium term?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that similar to the United Nations in some ways, it will need reform in terms of there will need to be where member states cannot hold, or one member state of each organisation cannot hold back potential expansion or stopping sanctions. I think this will be, the EU will certainly push towards a more majoritarian voting system where a majority of member states, and if they encompass a majority of the population of the European Union, that will be the new voting system that we will see. Whether that will happen remains to be seen. The EU only works effectively during a crisis. So if the Ukraine crisis were to end, then who knows, they may go back to the way it was before. But I think certainly that there will be an increasing call for reform. We may also see the idea of a multi-tiered Europe, of a multi-tiered EU, different integration methods, different processes in terms of integration for the EU. For NATO, I think, again, the voting system will have to be more majoritarian in its outlook, certainly. But this is all a what if at the moment. It's certainly something that hasn't come up for debate in Brussels and Mons today.
Very good indeed. Now, in a long-awaited speech on China, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Thursday that Washington was engaged in a vigorous competition with Beijing in order to preserve the world order, but denied any desire to enter into a new Cold War. But Beijing felt slandered by the speech of the head of the American diplomacy, who judged that China posed the most serious risk of questioning the international order.
We are not looking for conflict or a new Cold War. To the contrary, we're determined to avoid both. We don't seek to block China from its role as a major power, nor to stop China, or any other country for that matter, from growing their economy or advancing the interests of their people.
Blinken's speech is verbose and full of stratagems. In essence, he spreads false information, exaggerates the Chinese threat, interferes in China's internal affairs and China's domestic and foreign policies. The objective is to contain and suppress China's development and maintain U.S. hegemony and power. China is very unhappy and strongly opposes this speech.
Professor Stephen Hall, again, U.S. President Joe Biden, who often presents the current world in an opposition between democracies and autocracies, believes that this decade will be decisive. As Antony Blinken himself said, the United States recognizes that it will be difficult to change the path of China and the ambitions of President Xi Jinping. What can be read between the lines, Professor, here?
Well, I think certainly that the Americans traditionally see things in black and white, good versus evil, that democracies and autocracies are on opposite ends of the spectrum, and certainly in regards to China, in Southeast Asia and East Asia, countries have to make a choice between America or China. There's nothing in between. Balancing isn't a possibility anymore. In terms, Joe Biden also said that America will defend Taiwan, and we have seen that China has flown planes through Taiwanese airspace as well, relatively recently. So there certainly is a building up in East Asia. And this is also one of the reasons why China has not necessarily been supportive of Russia, but tried to make sure that Russia continues the war in Ukraine, and takes a long time to do it, because it's a way to keep America focused on Europe rather than on Asia, which China obviously does not want America to be too focused on Asia. Certainly, America needs to possibly find a new foreign policy that is more accommodative of this grey area between not just democracies on one side and autocracies on the other, and you have to choose sides, but to try and be a more focused foreign policy for individual states. And of course, there has to be a way, and this is, of course, very difficult because the relationship has broken down, to try and begin some sort of dialogue between China and America in order to try and find a way to de-escalate what are increasing growing tensions. This, of course, will be unpopular in America, in Congress and in the Senate. So, again, it remains to be seen as to whether this will happen. Right. And, of course, it also depends on what happens at the next presidential election. Joe Biden is unpopular. We could see a return to Donald Trump. Whether that's good or bad remains to be seen, but that would certainly change the dichotomy in American foreign policy towards China and, of course, towards Europe as well.
Very nice indeed. Ayub Soy, Professor Ayub Soy, let me give you this final question before we wrap it up. And briefly, please, US President did stir a bit of controversy in recent months by indicating that the United States is ready to defend Taiwan militarily. And his Secretary of State, meanwhile, accused China of exerting increasing coercion on Taiwan and raising tensions around the island. Here, don't you think that the US has already a lot on its plate with the war in Ukraine? And now we see that Blinken's intervention has put China back at the center of US geopolitical concerns after several months monopolized by the war in Ukraine.
It seems that the US government sees a window of opportunity to refocus on Indo-Pacific while Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, is occupied with its invasion of Ukrainian territory. Although the US officials are denying any intention to start a new Cold War, we have seen, for example, the formation of the Quad informal meeting composed of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. We have also seen the formation of the signing of AUKUS agreement between the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States. So it seems that a new Cold War has already begun in the Pacific, in Asia, and the major point of risk in the geopolitical
Professor
landscape.
Ayub, sorry to cut your train of thoughts. We have reached the end of our show. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis and interest in debate. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News with me, Karim Zachary. Bye for now.